A plane struck by lightning at 30,000 feet. The pilot's unconscious. And a 17-year-old boy with no flying experience forced to land the aircraft. This is the story of how James Harrison saved 243 lives in the most terrifying hour of his existence. Before we dive in, what time are you listening? A plane struck by lightning at 30,000 feet. Drop a comment below and tell me. And a 17-year-old boy with no flying experience forced to land the aircraft. James Harrison was not supposed to be in the cockpit. This is the story of how James Harrison saved 17 years old, sitting in seat 14A on flight 729 from Seattle to Miami. Headphones on. What time are you listening? Trying to finish his chemistry homework before the plane landed. Drop a comment below and tell me. He had never flown alone before. Please like and subscribe for more videos like this. His parents had put him on this flight to visit his grandmother was not supposed to be in the cockpit, and he was nervous but excited. He was 17 years old. The flight attendant seat 14A on flight 729 noticed his shaky hand Miami headphones on. Trying to finish his chemistry homework before the plane is the safest way to travel. He had never flown alone before. James wanted to believe her. His parents had put him on this flight to visit his grandmother in Florida. Everything seemed normal. And he was nervous but excited. James looked out the window. The flight attendant had smiled at him beneath the clouds. Noticed his shaky hands. He thought about his grandmother's cooking about the beach and told him everything 2 weeks away from school. Flying is the safest way to travel. What would happen next? James wanted to believe her. No one ever does. The plane 2 hours into the flight. The sky was clear. The sky changed. Everything seemed normal. The clouds outside his window looked out the window, thicker, and watched Seattle disappear. The plane started to shake. Not much at first. He thought about his grandmother's cooking about the beach. The seatbelt sign 2 weeks away from school. The flight attendants he did not think about what would happen checking next. Everyone, smiling. No one ever does. James gripped 2 hours into the flight. The shaking got noticed worse. The sky changing. The plane dropped suddenly. The clouds outside his window were getting darker. James's stomach thicker, angrier. A woman across the aisle started to shake. A child started crying. Just a little. Then the lights flickered. The seatbelt looked up at the overhead compartment. The flight attendants, the oxygen mask panels were checking everyone, smiling. The shaking continued. James gripped his armrest. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Got worse. Calm and plane dropped suddenly, telling everyone to remain seated. And James's stomach that they were passing. A woman across the aisle gasped that it would be over soon. A child started crying. James tried to relax. Then the lights flickered. He closed his eyes. James looked up at the overhead compartment. The plane dropped again. The oxygen mask panels were vibrating. Then shaking continued. Blinding the captain's voice came over the sound like the world splitting open. And professional. The entire plane lit up as if 1,000 cameras had gone off at once. They were passing through a storm. Lightning. That it would be over soon. Had been struck by lightning. James tried to relax. Every passenger closed his eyes. The lights went out completely. The plane dropped again harder this time, and some red strips along the floor. Then came the flash. The engines made a horrible grinding sound. Then one of them went silent, splitting open. The plane tilted. The entire plane lit up as if 1,000 cameras had gone off thrown against the window. Lightning. His chemistry book. The aircraft had been struck by lightning. People were screaming. Every passenger froze. The flight attendants were shouting instructions. Emergency lighting trying to keep everyone calm. Red strips along James the floor. Could hear the fear in their voices. Made a horrible grinding sound. The plane was falling. Then one of them went silent. Not yet, but definitely tilted to the left. James could feel it. James was thrown against the window. That sickening sensation of dropping flew across the gravity, pulling them down. People were screaming now. He thought about his parents. The flight attendants were shouting about his grandmother waiting, trying to keep everyone calm. He thought this might be the end. Hear the fear in their voices. Then the intercom crackled. The plane was falling, but this time it was not the captain's voice, definitely falling. It was a flight attendant. James could feel it in his chest. She sounded terrified. She said the words that made James's blood turn to ice. Gravity pulling them down. We need help in the cockpit. He thought about his pilot on board. Is anyone about his grandmother waiting at the airport? No one answered. He thought this might be the James looked around the cabin. Then the intercom crackled. Everyone was frozen, staring at each other. It was not the captain's waiting for someone to stand up to save the flight attendant. No one did. She sounded terrified. The flight attendant said the words that made James's blood turn to ice. More we need help in the cockpit. The plane shook. Is there a pilot on board? The nose dipped. Is anyone here a pilot? They were losing altitude fast. No one answered. James did not know what made him looked around the cabin. Maybe it was panic. Everyone was frozen. Maybe it was some insane idea that he could help. Waiting for someone to stand up. Maybe he just could not sit there and wait to die. The flight attendant repeated the question and stood up. Louder. The flight attendant saw him and rushed over. She grabbed his arm violently. Are you a pilot? She asked. Her eyes were losing altitude fast. James did not know what made him do it, he said. Maybe it was panic. But I have played flight simulator. Maybe it was some insane idea that he could help. The flight attendant could not sit there and wait to die. For a moment, James thought she was going to tell him to sit down. Stood up. To stop. The flight attendant saw him and rushed over. But she did not. She grabbed his arm. She looked back toward the cockpit. Are you a pilot? She asked. Then back at him. Her eyes were wide, pleading. She said, James followed her down the aisle, he said. His legs felt like jelly. But I have played flight simulators. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might explode. The flight attendant stared at him. Passengers reached out for a moment. James thought she was going to tell him to sit down, asking him if he knew how to fly, wasting her time, asking him, but she did not. She did not answer toward the cockpit. He could not. Then back at him. The cockpit door was open. Come with me, she said. Inside, the James followed her down the aisle. The captain was slumped over the controls, unconscious. His heart was pounding so hard convulsing in her seat. Explode. Blood trickling from passengers reached out as he passed. The lightning strike had sent a surge, asking him if he knew how to fly, and both pilots had been shocked. He did not answer. The flight attendant checked their pulses. The cockpit door was open, she said. Inside, the scene was chaos. She looked at James. The captain was slumped over the controls, unconscious. James stood in the doorway. The co-pilot was convulsing in her control panel. Blood trickling from like the simulators. The lightning strike and sent a surge through the electrical system. Half of them were flashing red, shocked. Alarms. The flight attendant checked their pulses. The artificial horizon showed the plane tilted at a dangerous angle. They are out. The altimeter was spinning down. All we have. 28,000 James stood in the doorway, 27,000, staring at the control panel. They were dropping 1,000 feet every 30 seconds. There were hundreds of buttons, stepped switches, screens, dials. His hands were shaking so badly he had to clench them into fists. Alarms were screaming. The flight attendant, the artificial horizon showed the plane tilted at a dangerous angle. Jump seat behind the altimeter was spinning downward. Then she looked at James. 28,000 feet. 27,000. James sat in the captain's chair. They were dropping 1,000 feet every 30 seconds. He stared at the James stepped the steering column in front of him. His hands were shaking so badly he had to clench them into dozens of times before learning how to land. The captain out of his seat, those were games, and strapped him into a jump seat behind the controls. 243 people were depending on him. He wrapped his hands around the yoke and pulled back. James sat in the captain's chair. The plane responded. It was still warm. The nose lifted. He stared at the yoke. The steering column slowed its descent. 26,000 feet. He had crashed dozens of times before learning how to land to himself, and those were games. Okay, the flight attendant leaned over his shoulder. 243 people were depending on him. James did not know. He wrapped his hands around the yoke and pulled back gently. They were still 300 miles from Miami. The nose lifted the fuel gauge. The altimeter slowed its descent. He looked at the engine 26,000 feet. One engine was dead. The other was running, but barely. We need to land. The flight attendant leaned over his shoulder. His voice sounded strange, distant, like someone else did not know. He looked at the navigation. The flight attendant asked. They were still 300 miles from Miami, trying to remember everything he had learned from those stupid games. They had enough he played in his bedroom. He looked at the engine. There was an airport. One engine was dead. The other was running northwest, barely. He pointed at the screen. James there. His voice sounded strange, distant. She grabbed someone else was speaking. Mayday, mayday, this is flight attendant 29. James scanned struck by lightning, trying to remember everything he had learned from those stupid games. We have a miner on the controls. We need immediate assistance. Static. A small one. Then a voice, 80 miles northwest. Flight 729, this is Jacksonville Center. The flight attendant nodded. What is your position? She grabbed the radio. James read off the coordinates. Mayday, this is flight 729. The air traffic controller responded immediately. Both pilots are incapacitated. We are vectoring you to a miner on the controls. We need immediate assistance. Is clear. Static. Emergency services are standing professional. Flight 729, this is Jacksonville Center. James looked at the panel. He found the autopilot button. James read off the coordinates from the screen. The lightning had fried. The air traffic controller responded said into the radio. It is not working. We are vectoring you toward Tallahassee Regional. Then the controller spoke again. Runway 27 this time, like he was choosing. Emergency services are standing by. Okay. Do you know how to operate the autopilot? You are going to hand fly this aircraft all the way to the runway. He found the autopilot button. I am going to talk you through every single step. The lightning had fried. I say. No, James said into the radio. Yes, it is not working. His mouth was dry. Then the controller spoke again, slower this time, like he was choosing his words instructions. Reduce throttle. Listen very carefully. Maintain heading. You are going to hand fly this aircraft all the way to the runway. Every command. I am going to talk you through every single step. It was sluggish, unstable. Do exactly what I say. The dead engine was creating drag, yes, pulling them to the left. James said. James had to fight the yoke constantly. His vision was starting to blur from fear. His arms were already. The controller began giving instructions. Sweat dripped down his face. Adjust the flight attendant stood behind heading 290 the altimeter. James followed calling out their altitude every 1,000 feet. The plane responded 20,000. Sluggish, unstable. 19,000. The dead engine was creating drag. They were descending them to the left. James had to told James to adjust the flaps them level to slow their descent. His arms were already James aching. Found the flap lever and sweat dripped down his face. The plane shuddered. The flight attendant stood behind him, watching the altimeter. James
calling
thought
out
they
their
were
altitude
every 1,000 feet,
backwards and plummet.
20,000, but the plane
19,000.
The descent slowed.
18,000.
17,000.
They were descending
feet.
too fast.
16,000. The controller told
felt
James
like hours
to adjust the flaps
60 miles
to
from
slow
the
their
airport.
descent. The second
James
engine
found the
started
flap
to fail
lever
and pulled it. The oil
plane
pressure was
shuddered.
dropping. The nose
temperature
pitched
was
up.
rising.
For a moment, the controller
James
saw it
thought
on
they
his
were going to
radar and his
stall,
voice
to
flipped
flip
backwards and
You
plummet.
are losing your remaining
plane
engine.
held. The
You
distance
need to get
slowed.
on the ground now.
17,000
James
feet.
felt the power draining away.
16,000. The minutes
The
felt
plane
like
was
hours.
gliding now,
60
barely
miles from the
staying
airport.
in the air.
The second
You could
engine
see the
started
ground
to through the
fail.
windscreen.
The
Green
oil
fields
pressure
and
was
forests
dropping.
rushing up. The
toward
temperature
them.
was rising. The flight
The
attendant
controller
gripped
saw
his
it on his
shoulder.
radar and his voice
"You can
tightened.
do this," she
You are
said.
losing your remaining
James
engine.
did not believe her.
You need to get on
But
the
he
ground
kept his
now.
hands on the yoke.
James felt the
The
power
controller
draining
guided
away.
him through the approach.
The plane was gliding
Line
now,
up with runway
barely
27.
staying in the air.
Descend to
He could see
3,000
the ground
feet.
through the windscreen.
Lower your landing
Green
gear.
fields and forests
James found
rushing
the
up
gear lever
toward
and
them.
pulled it. The
Three
flight
green
attendant
lights
gripped his
appeared on the
shoulder.
panel. The
"You
gear
can
was
do this,"
down,
she said.
The runway appeared in
James
the
did not
distance.
believe her.
A thin grey
But
line
he kept his
cutting
hands
through
on
the
the
trees.
yoke.
It
The
looked
controller
impossibly
guided
small.
him through the approach. The controller
Line
kept
up with
talking,
runway
kept guiding
27.
him.
Reduce
Descend
speed
to 3,000 feet.
140 knots.
Lower your landing
Keep your
gear.
wings level.
James
Watch
found the
your
gear
glide
lever
slope.
and pulled it.
You are doing great.
3 green
Stay
lights
focused.
appeared on the panel.
James was not doing
The
great.
gear
He
was
was
down.
terrified. The
His
runway
entire
appeared
body
in the
was
distance.
shaking.
A
The
thin
plane was
grey
too
line
fast.
cutting through the
The
trees.
runway was too
It
short.
looked impossibly
He was
small.
going to crash. The
He was
controller
going to
kept
kill
talking,
everyone.
kept
2,000
guiding him.
feet.
Reduce speed to
1,000
140
The
knots.
ground was right
Keep
there.
your wings level.
James could see
Watch your
fire
glide
trucks
slope.
lining the runway.
You are doing great.
Ambulances,
Stay
police
focused.
cars.
James was
He could
not
see
doing
people
great. He was
watching,
terrified. 500
His entire
feet.
body was shaking.
The controller's
The plane
voice
was
was
too
steady,
fast.
almost
The
soothing.
runway was too short.
Flare, pull back
He
on
was
the
going
yoke
to crash.
gently.
He was
Now,
going to kill everyone.
James pulled back.
2,000
The nose
feet.
lifted. The plane
1,000
floated
feet.
for a moment.
The ground was
Suspended
right
between
there.
sky and earth.
James could see
Then
fire
the wheels
trucks
touched
lining
the
the
runway.
runway.
Ambulances,
Hard.
police cars.
Too hard. The plane
He could
bounced
see
lifted
people
back into
watching,
the air.
waiting. 500
James's heart
feet.
stopped. He
The
pushed the
controller's
yoke
voice
forward.
was steady.
The wheels
almost
hit again,
soothing.
and this
Flare,
time they
pull
stayed
back
down.
on the yoke.
The
Gently.
plane was on the ground.
James
But it
pulled
was
back.
going too
the nose
fast,
lifted.
way too
The
fast.
plane floated for a
James
moment,
slammed on the
suspended
brakes.
between sky
Plane
and earth.
skidded.
Then
Tires
the wheels
screaming,
touched the runway.
smoke pouring from the
Hard.
wheels.
Too
The
hard.
end of the
plane
runway
bounced
was coming
lifted
up
back
fast.
into the air.
A fence.
James's heart stopped.
James pulled
pushed
the
the yoke
emergency
forward.
brake. The
The
wheels
plane
hit
jerked
again,
violently
and this
to the
time
right,
they stayed down.
then straightened
The
out.
plane was on the
It
ground.
slowed,
but it was going
and
too
stopped.
fast, way too
50
fast.
feet from the end of the
James
runway.
slammed on the
For a
brakes.
moment, there was
The
silence.
plane skidded.
Then
Tires
the cabin
screaming,
erupted in
smoke
cheers.
pouring from the wheels.
People were crying,
The end of the
hugging each
runway
other,
was coming up
shouting
fast.
thank you
A
toward the
fence
cockpit.
trees.
James
The flight
pulled the
attendant
emergency
collapsed
brake.
into the jump
The plane
seat.
jerked
Tears
violently
streaming
to the right,
down her face.
then straightened out.
James sat frozen in the
slowed
captain's chair
and stopped,
staring out
50
the
feet from
windscreen
the
at
end
the
of the
fire
runway.
trucks racing
For a
toward them.
moment, there was silence.
His hands were still
Then the
gripping
cabin
the yoke.
erupted in cheers.
He could not let go.
People were crying,
The controller's
hugging each
voice
other,
came through the
shouting
radio one
thank
last
you
time.
toward the cockpit.
Flight 729,
The flight
you are down
attendant
safe.
collapsed into the jump
Outstanding
seat.
job, son.
Tears streaming
Outstanding.
down her face.
James tried to
James
respond,
sat frozen
but
in
no
the
words
captain's
came
chair,
out. Staring
He just
out
sat
the
there
windscreen
shaking
at the
as
fire
emergency
trucks
crews
racing
surrounded
the plane. His
The
hands were
passengers
still gripping the
evacuated
yoke.
down the emergency
He could
slides.
not let go.
Paramedics
The controller's
rushed into
voice
the
came
cockpit
through the radio
and
one
began
last
treating
time.
the unconscious
Flight
pilots.
729, you are down
Someone
safe.
wrapped a blanket around
Outstanding
James's
job,
shoulders.
Outstanding.
Someone else
James
guided
tried
him
to
out of the
respond,
cockpit,
but no
down
words
the
came
aisle
out.
out of the plane.
He just sat there
His legs
shaking
gave
as
out on the
emergency
tarmac,
crews surrounded
and a
the
firefighter
plane.
caught him.
The passengers
He looked up at the
evacuated
plane.
down the emergency
At the
slides.
scorch marks along the
Paramedics
fuselage
rushed
where the
into the
lightning had
cockpit
struck
and began
at the
treating
blown
the
engine
unconscious
hanging
pilots.
uselessly from the wing.
Someone
He
wrapped
had
a
landed
blanket
that.
around James's shoulders.
Somehow, impossibly,
Someone else
he
guided
had
him out
landed
of the
that.
cockpit.
James
Down the
Harrison
aisle
became
out
a
of the
national
plane.
sensation overnight.
His legs gave out on the
News
tarmac.
crews mobbed the
and a
airport.
firefighter caught him.
His face was on
He
every
looked up at the
television
plane.
screen in the country.
At the scorch
The
marks
team
along the
who saved
fuselage
Flight
where the lightning had
729.
struck. At
He
the
gave
blown
interviews,
engine hanging
met the
uselessly
president,
from the wing.
received awards
He had
from
landed
aviation
that.
organizations. Somehow,
The
impossibly,
passengers sent him
he
letters
had landed
thanking
that.
him. Calling
James
him a hero.
Harrison became a national
The
sensation promotion overnight. The pilots recovered fully and personally thanked him.
The airport
Said he had given them a second chance. On every television screen in the country. James went back to school. The team who saved Flight 729. Everyone treated him differently. He gave interviews, met the teachers, students, received awards from aviation organizations. All of them looked at him like he was something special. Sent him letters thanking him, but James calling him a hero. Special. He felt the pilots recovered fully and personally that the plane had not broken apart. Said he had given them a second chance at life. Lucky that the runway had been long enough. James went back to school 3 weeks later. Lucky that the controller had known exactly what to say. Lucky that he had played those stupid flight simulators to and had some idea, however small, he was something special. He still had nightmares. Did not feel special. He woke up in the middle of the night. feeling the plane falling,
not broken
hearing
apart
the
in
alarms,
midair,
seeing the ground
that the
rushing
runway had
toward
been
him.
long enough.
His hands would
Lucky that
shake,
the controller had
and he
known
would have to
exactly
remind
what to
himself
say.
that it was over.
Lucky that he had played
that
those
everyone
stupid
was
flight
safe.
simulators,
But he also
had some
thought about
idea,
the flight
however
attendant
small,
who
of
had
what
trusted
to do.
him. He still
The
had
controller who
nightmares.
had believed in him.
He woke up in the middle of
The
the
passengers
night,
who had stayed
feeling
calm,
the plane falling,
even though they were
hearing the
terrified.
alarms, seeing the
He
ground
thought about
rushing
how,
toward
in the
him.
worst moment of his life,
His hands would shake
when everything
and
seemed
he would have to
impossible,
remind himself
he had not
that it
given
was
up.
over.
He had taken
That
control,
everyone was safe,
and he had brought
but
them
he
home.
also thought about the
James
flight
never
attendant
flew
who
again
had
as a
trusted
passenger.
him.
But
The
2 years
controller
later,
who
on
had
his
believed in
19th
him.
birthday, he
The
enrolled
passengers
in
who
flight
had
school.
stayed calm,
If
even
he was
though
going
they
to
were
be in a
terrified.
cockpit, he decided.
He thought
He
about
wanted
how
to know
in
in
the
the
worst
worst
moment
moment
of
of his
doing.
life, when
He wanted
everything
to be ready,
seemed impossible,
because
he had not
sometimes
given up.
the world
He
asks
had taken
you to do the
control,
impossible,
and he had brought them
sometimes,
home.
somehow you find
James
a way.
never flew again as a
So
passenger.
if you like this video, please
2
like
years
and
later, on his
subscribe for more
19th
videos
birthday,
like this.
he enrolled in flight school. If he was going to be in a cockpit, he decided he wanted to know exactly what he was doing. He wanted to be ready. Because sometimes the world asks you to do the impossible, and sometimes, somehow you find a way. So if you like this video, please like and subscribe for more videos like this.